not everything in creation has the capacity to grieve. Not every being has the capacity for such complex emotional range. And it makes us in awe. And so I think when we think about ourselves and the capacity that we have to mourn for what is gone, to recognize it as gone and to feel it deeply, I think that is a beautiful design of God.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I have an incredibly special guest that I'm very excited to connect with today. Her name is Clarissa Moll. She is an award-winning writer and podcaster who helps bereaved people find flourishing after loss. Her new book is titled Beyond the Darkness, A Gentle Guide for Living with Grief and Thriving After Loss. This is it here. Just came out, just released. So very, very excited to welcome her today. Clarissa, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited. First of all, before we go into it, I just want to tell you thank you. I mean, for the work that you're doing, really. I want to capture some of the highlights from the book, but I want to reserve enough that people do go out and pick it up as well. But again, I just want to thank you right off the top. The content that we're going to be getting in today, what your book really is, and your story, your journey. It's not easy to do this. It requires a tremendous amount of courage and vulnerability. And so I want to thank you for that.
Thank you
And
so much.
one of the things that sort of struck me, the title itself, Beyond the Darkness, you have the subtitle there of A Gentle Guide for Living with Grief and Thriving After Loss. And I thought, a gentle guide is such a unique way to kind of describe a book, a resource to have, and specifically the adjective gentle. And it really kind of sparked my curiosity. I thought, well, I wonder what that really translates to. But after reading the book, I think it couldn't be more appropriate or more spot on to describe it. I think it's one of the most appropriate ways to navigate through the emotions, the strategies. This is a very strategic, practical guide as well. But you approach it with such a gentle authenticity that I think makes it really accessible for readers and for people that are going through grief right now. Just to kind of give the viewers and the listeners here, just kind of a reference point for how things really started for you 3 years ago and what sort of took place in this really life-changing transformational moment. What did that look like at that time?
Sure. Well, in 2019, my husband and I and our 4 children had just made a cross-country move from Seattle to Boston for work. And we were excited to take a family vacation, head back to what had always felt like home for us back on the West Coast. And kind of the capstone of my husband's vacation, he was working while we were on the road. And so for him, that little space of vacation on that trip was going to be a long ridgeline hike in Mount Rainier National Park. Rob was a conscientious hiker. He was very experienced. He loved the backcountry, loved the opportunity to get away from his phone and from the laptop and from all of the requirements of his life and just be able to unwind and connect with God in the wilderness. And so that's what his hope had been that day, to be able to head out there with his hiking partner and bag a couple peaks and have a really good time. But I didn't hear from him when he was supposed to return to the trailhead that day. And I became worried, but we had always had a plan that, if his cell phone died or there was just not cell service, I didn't need to be worried. He would contact me as soon as he was able. So I kind of tamped down that fear for the rest of the afternoon. But a growing sense of ill ease kind of came over me. And at 7:30 that night, when a large white SUV pulled into my campsite and 2 uniformed chaplains got out, I knew that the news was going to be really bad. Rob fell to his death that day in Mount Rainier National Park. And, even 3 years later, when I say those words, I think, gosh, I'm able to say them out loud. It's so tragic. It was traumatic. And And yet here we are, this unexpected loss that shook our world, that reshaped my entire life, my plans for the future. It hasn't been the death of me too. And I feel like that is a particular gift of God, that to endure something so terrible would not break me. But I hope through the process of grieving over the last 3 years, of finding companionship in that unwelcome visitor who really sort of moved in and reshaped our entire existence, that it's been a growing experience, that grief has not broken me, but it's remade me.
Incredible. Like I mentioned, the amount of courage, to step forward over these last 3 years and to approach it the way that you have in such a realistic and healthy way, an intentional way, a very purposeful way, is something that I think everyone can take away from, regardless of what their past experiences might be with loss in their own life. With it being so sudden, like you mentioned, you have your 4 children, all of these plans for life and what the vision is and for what you all are doing and what's happening and all these things just shifts so suddenly. I think a lot of people that are listening and watching today have had moments like that, right, in their own life, where there's sudden change that occurs, and challenges and difficulties. The book that you broke up into is 3 parts here. We'll kind of jump into this first part of preparation for the journey. So after this sudden shift takes place, you break down these myths, right? That loss and grief can somehow be compared in different ways, or they have to be compartmentalized in appropriate ways or the right ways. And I love how you've kind of structured this breakdown of it. Also, like you just mentioned, sharing that grief is now a new companion to embrace along in the journey, I think is something incredibly healthy, right? Instead of running away from it and avoiding it and trying to neglect all of the responsibilities and the demands and the pressures that you're facing, you're now embracing grief and this mourning in a very personalized way. And so, again, for everybody out there right now, there's going to be takeaways throughout this story as Clarissa shares with us things that you can certainly apply in your own life. But what I want to jump into again is these myths, being some losses are worse than others. There's a right way to grieve. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and time heals all wounds. Can you kind of break down that experience for you, how you kind of came across each of these bridges that you needed to cross in your own journey, and what that kind of looked like for you?
Sure. Well, whether or not you've experienced the sudden loss of a loved one, I feel like these myths are just endemic to our culture. We really prize individualism, we prize capacity and capability. And so when anything shifts our lives dramatically, whether that is a job loss or a divorce, a chronic illness, we encounter these messages from our culture that say, shoulder through, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Or they might tell us, you know what, it's not a big deal. Just wipe off the dirt and get back in the game. And these kind of messages really hinder us from the kind of integration that we need to do as we engage with our loss, and the kind of flourishing that we all long for on the other side of whatever terrible thing has befallen us. Uh, you know, it's often that folks will tell me, I can't imagine what you've gone through, or, I lost a parent, but it's not the same as losing a husband. And for sure, every loss is different, right? There are dimensions to every loss that are different. I can't step into your experience of grief because it's so intimate. It's so tied to the particulars of your situation. And yet grief is also universal too. There is a common brokenness that we all exist under in this fallen world. There's a common sorrow that we share just as humanity. And so oftentimes these myths that our culture builds around grief can actually isolate us from one another. They can prompt us toward a victimization or self-victimization, which can be super dangerous when you're trying to pull yourself out of a situation and make connections that will give you life and help you to move forward. And that isolation can just make us feel like everything is dark around us. Our culture, you talk about a gentle guide. I think our culture jostles around people who are hurting. It's sort of
Yeah.
very assembly line, like throw them onto the conveyor belt and they shake around a little bit. And hopefully they'll get from A to B, from point A to point B, from hurting to healed. But the reality is that recovery, healing, they're lifelong processes, whether that is from the loss of a loved one or from any kind of really disruptive kind of grief that you experience. And so gentleness is the word that is certainly the operative word that we need to use when we talk about caring for people who are hurting, because they don't need our platitudes. They don't need the kind of cultural myths that tell us to be strong, that don't honor our weakness as something that is sacred. Instead, we need gentleness,
Wow.
attendance to their pain, and a long view for the kind of care and support they'll need to flourish again.
Oh, that's so good. It's so true too that we're limited culturally. Here in the West, especially, one of the things you mentioned is just the language that we use around it, and how you said, even some of these platitudes that we have and things like that, to just in an attempt to ease the pain or to make it better, or to make it somehow relatable. We try as individuals, but we're so incredibly uncomfortable of getting into that space, even in our own lives, let alone with other people. Well, and so you mentioned language, using the word dying, death. It's this very like, whoa, that's the D word. Like, did you say that? Like, can we go there? Instead of something that would appear to be a little bit more graceful about it, like they've passed on and things like that. And it's not as if there's a right way or a wrong way, but like you said, I think one of the things that we need to do as individuals to kind of have that space and that ability to connect in a really meaningful way is a willingness to be compassionate with one another. And you talk a lot about that in the book, which is the most powerful thing that I believe that we're called to do, as people of faith, and the example that Christ had really set to be more compassionate. The definition of compassion is to suffer together. And when I first discovered that, I thought, well, how odd, like, why would we be called to suffer together more? Like, like, what's the point of just suffering more? And I realized what happens when we're willing to do that is suffering begins to diminish when it's shared openly, when we can drop those walls and connect with another human person, right? The suffering that gets divided. And the beautiful thing, and you mentioned this in the book, how sorrow doesn't replace joy, and joy doesn't replace sorrow. They can coexist. I think the beautiful thing about God's design with this is that while we are willing to be compassionate and share that sorrow in order to alleviate it, when we share our joy, the opposite is true, that it expands, it multiplies. The next section here, tools for survival. This is one of my favorite parts about your design of this book. Is it's, again, very practical. You give these strategies, and as somebody that's in the healthcare field, I was amazed at some of the health issues
Mhm.
that you started to elaborate on. Can you kind of describe what that was like, both in your own journey and things that you've learned about that process of grief for people and how it impacts their health?
Yeah, we carry our sorrows in our bodies. We're not separate mind and spirit and body. We are an integrated whole person. And so when you experience something intellectually, your gut knows it too. And when your heart is broken, you feel it in your muscles and all over your body. And so when it comes to addressing grief and sorrow, we can't just look at the outward emotions that a person might carry. We need to look at the body as well. And I feel like one of the most incredibly healing parts of my grief experience was to recognize the ways that my body actually could heal. So, my heart will always be broken in some way or another that my husband is not here with me. There will never be a moment where I forget his presence. And yet, I don't need to carry that that sadness, that sorrow in my body in a way that affects my health in a long term kind of fashion. And a lot of folks don't understand that. They go through brain fog after a loss, or, they have trouble concentrating. They experience digestive issues or sleep disruptions, and they think, well, something must be wrong with me. But there's nothing wrong with you. Your body is always sending you signals, and it's just asking to be attended to. And so for a lot of folks, the first steps of dealing with grief and becoming accustomed to that companion in their lives is to address their bodies, to simply look at basic things like movement, like sleeping, like eating, and say, okay, I know that I am a whole person, that grief is residing at the kitchen table with me when I sit down to eat, that grief is lying beside me in that bed where my spouse used to lie. How am I going to address my body's needs so that I can kind of deal with some of the more complex sorts of needs that I have, the practical needs of finances or career changes, family disruptions, and the spiritual and emotional questions that arise after grief?
Wow. That is so important for people to consider, and like you were outlining, it's normal,
Mhm.
right? I think it's so important for people that may have experienced the sudden loss, the nature of the loss that you had, where all these shifts might occur really quickly, not just emotionally and in the external environment, but like you said, physically in their body, from gut health and grief brain, as you described it. That was a new
Yeah.
term for me, but confusion, disorientation, not being able to make decisions the same way, all these different things that can really manifest physically. It's really important for people to recognize this is all under the umbrella of normal.
Yeah, that's
Um,
right. Yeah, and especially if you've been a caregiver for someone with a terminal illness and you've been loving them as they were engaging in the dying process, there's a lot of exhaustion that comes along with that, physical exhaustion, and it can be really tough to go to the doctor after your person dies. Really, really hard. Whether it was there are some medical triggers that just prompt really difficult emotions, whether your person was your support in the room, whether you feel like your doctor is going to think you're crazy or that they're going to over medicate you or under medicate. There's so many concerns that we have when we engage with the medical profession after loss. But I will say that with some work, you can find a provider who offers you the kind of sensitive care that you need. It took me a little while personally to find that person, but I have to tell you, when I walked into that room and she looked me in the eyes and she said, I can't believe what you've been through. And she's got tears in her eyes. And I think, okay, it's going to be all right. Like, here's
yeah,
somebody who can care for my body gently in the way that I need. And it's worth the effort to find that person.
absolutely. Oh my goodness. No, I love that. That's really good advice. As a doctor of physical therapy, I've had a number of people that I've worked with in different settings, from hospital settings to rehab settings, where we all have a little bit of hypochondriacism.
Mhm.
Like, especially we can Google any ailment or
That's
illness
right.
now, and things just run away from us. And so when something's happening and we don't know why, especially in the midst of pain and hurt already that's happening, then we think, oh, and now I have this, and now, oh, but maybe it could also be this. And especially when there's the fear and concern related to death, that's where a lot of us drift naturally, is this fear of, well, maybe what I have, it's terminal. And so to be able to find a provider that's patient, that's
Mhm.
kind, that's a good listener, is so critically important. So I love that you outlined that. Also, the breakdown you described, going from this idea of of eating, sleeping, and exercising, you reframe it and you say, let's think about this as far as finding nourishment, rest, and moving. And that's so important, because when we're already dealing with so many different things all at once, then we want to add to it and say, well, I know I'm supposed to be getting 3 meals, and I'm not getting 8 hours of sleep. And we can just add more weight and gravity
Mhm.
that's not necessary. And I love how you make it so approachable to say, okay, well, maybe sleep right now, it's going to come in smaller doses at different intervals. maybe getting up and moving in the most healthy way isn't necessarily getting after it in the gym on the
Mhm.
treadmill. It's just simply going for a walk right now
Yeah.
and just maintaining those health aspects.
Yeah, it's amazing when you talk about um, the book being helpful for people who are supportive of grieving people, the sort of grief adjacent, if you will.
Mm.
I think that's important for them to hear as well. If you're supporting someone who is grieving, don't encourage them to take seconds at a meal. If they pick at their food, if they push it around on the plate, if they don't want meals in the meal train, that's all within the realm of okay.
Yeah.
And in the same vein, if you want to encourage them to take good care of their body in grief, invite them out for a walk.
Yeah.
Something that's
Yeah.
so gentle and non-confrontational. Those kinds of things can be a really easy way for you to support a grieving friend, knowing that these very basic parts of caring for their body may be super hard for them right now.
Yeah. Gosh, it's so good. There's a couple sections here. You start to get into the emotional dynamics of grief, and I think this is that landscape that we were talking about that is so tricky, and it's shifting and it's changing day to day. I want to read just a section here from the book. You say grief isn't just a passing feeling, it's an emotion and a capacity that God wove into our bodies at birth. It's part of the marvelous design, divine design of emotional range. God built into us the ability to love, forgive, hope, and yes, grieve. I think that's so powerful to kind of start this journey, or maybe someone that's been going through the experience of grieving for a decade or more. It's so powerful to approach it that way, to say, you know what? Grief is an intentional part of God's design for us and the whole spectrum of human emotions. So instead of, all of these challenges compounding and then looking at grief as just something that should be avoided at all costs, again, your theme of embracing it and pulling it in and accepting it and integrating it and saying, hey, there's really profound ways to express grief the same way that we do when we have hope and love and all of the other wonderful emotions. Can you comment on that? I just thought that was such a beautiful section there about God's design and how he built us to be able to grieve, that it's a necessary part of the journey for us.
Yeah, on when we see it on the news, evening news about a dog who sits at the airport waiting for his soldier to come home, and or stands beside the casket at a funeral, we think, oh wow, isn't that beautiful? This dog it's grieving. Why do we marvel at this? Because not everything in creation has the capacity to grieve. Not every being has the capacity for such complex emotional range, and it makes us in awe. And so I think when we think about ourselves and the capacity that we have to mourn for what is gone, to recognize it as gone and to feel it deeply, I think that is a beautiful design of God. Throughout scriptures, we see God grieving over Israel, we see Jesus weeping, so we know that within the Godhead, there exists this capacity to grieve. And so we know as image bearers that we reflect that as well. So in our anger, we can meet God there. In our love, we can meet God there. And even in our grief, we can meet God there, know more about his character, about his love for us, and to step more fully into our belovedness as we own that, not as a detractor from who we truly are, but as an integral part of who we are.
Wow. That your writing and your take on this it's poetic. It really is. I mean, this is, again, it's a practical book. I want everyone to get out there and to pick up this book, but there's so many different ways that you describe this. It's absolutely poetic. It's a beautiful way of describing these things. I'm going to go ahead and read this one as well. I have notes and highlights, I mean, galore from this thing. Often the emotions that we stuff away or hold back are the ones that offer us the most wisdom when we turn with compassion and listen. Isn't that true in so many ways for like our daily life?
Yeah.
A lot of times when we face a new challenge, a new difficulty comes up, something that brings fear, we want to stuff it away. We want to avoid it. We turn to procrastinating and busyness of life and busy work instead of just approaching those emotions. And one of the ways I've described it before in some of the workshops and trainings that I do is fear of these emotions that kind of plague us sometimes, that they're kind of hiding in the dark recesses and corners of our mind and our heart. And I think of it a lot like scary movies. If you're watching a scary movie, the enemy, the creature, whatever it is always scariest when it's hiding in the shadows. But as soon as it's revealed in the movie, everyone's reaction is always the same. It's like, oh, is that all it is?
Yeah.
Like, I thought it was going to be so much worse. The special effects aren't even great. The makeup's horrible. I thought it was going to be X.
Mhm.
And these emotions that you're describing in this passage are so consistent with that if we're not willing to confront them and draw them out into the light, they remain these big, difficult monsters and challenges that paralyze us in different ways. But once we bring them out and we can see them for what they really are through God's grace and His goodness, we can overcome them. We
Mhm.
can find out how to live with them. We can integrate them, like you described. And oftentimes, they're the ones that reveal the most growth and opportunities for insight and wisdom. And grief, like you described, being a catalyst for growth is such a massive reframe for that. We mentioned it earlier, but I don't want to leave it hanging because I think it's such an important part for everyone. The danger of platitudes and avoiding those negative feelings. I'm going to read this other section here. Many Christians feel they cannot grieve because they believe in heaven and the hope that comes from being united with their lost loved ones after death. They worry about getting too close to sadness, despair, and anger. Negative, quote, negative feelings they've been taught Christians should avoid. Just as our culture uses platitudes to lessen the shock of death, we often twist or simplify spiritual truths in an attempt to offer the same comfort. We say things like, rejoice, she's in heaven. This was all part of God's plan. God must have something better for you. God must have needed an angel. All of these ring hollow. Why? Because they're simply not truth. Oversimplified at best, entirely heretical at worst. That is one of the most profound sections in the book because we all fall into that as believers, as people of faith, as Christians. We're like, well, there's a short summary for it, right? That
That's
just
right.
takes away all the heartache, all the pain, and it makes it great. And I had mentioned to someone about the interview today in your book, and I said, well, I described the theme and your journey briefly, and they had a very short remark, with good intentions, but it was exactly what you were describing. They were like, when we lose loved ones, they're in heaven. It's great. It's great. And I'm like, life has to continue. Like there's no way to summarize all of the things that happen with grief and loss into just this quick little phrase, no matter how much we want all of our faith and our belief to just carry us through and it to magically vanish and everything to be well. Can you kind of describe that also? Because again, I think this is important for people to hear that may be supporters,
Yeah.
because we're
Yeah.
so quick to jump to these things and say, "Oh, it's God's plan," without the intention of minimizing it. It can happen too easily that way. So, just share your thoughts on that. I think it's important for people to hear.
Sure. Yeah, I think that, I will say over and over again, and that, when folks ask me, what can I do for my grieving friend? I say, give them the gift of your presence. That is the one thing they need. They don't need your words. They don't need your meals. They don't need you to pick up their mail. They need you to show up for them. They need you to sit beside them on the sofa without saying a word. They need a hug. They need 6 months, a year, 5 years down the line for you to remember their person with them. And when we begin with the gift of presence, I think a lot of those platitudes kind of fizzle out all on their own. It's when we're not committed to the long term kind of care that's necessary when people are hurting that we use those kind of band aid sorts of solutions. We drop off a meal and we say, "Well, I've done my job. I can say check that box." Or, I sent them a really nice Hallmark card with a pithy statement and a Bible verse inside, and we say that we've done our job. But the reality is that living in a broken world means that that care needs to take a long time to grow and to lift that person out of the very deepest and darkest acute moments of their grief. And so, if you commit to being present with a person, then you can be okay messing up every so often. I like to talk about it as sort of fumbling toward our words of consolation. None of us are really good at it. And it feels like this sort of teenage romance of not being able to get the words out to say how much I love you, and it's awkward. But that's what we do. And you think about any kind of long-term relationship, you think about marriage, those first years, they're rough, they're passionate, but they are also a lot of sparks. Iron is sharpening iron. But
Yeah.
over the years, those sorts of things, they kind of level out in really healthy relationships, to the point where your spouse says something that's difficult or offensive to you, and you keep quick accounts or short accounts. Your spouse says something that just doesn't seem kind, and you think, well, he had a rough day at work today, and I'm going to let that go. We're able to filter a lot better. How can we do those things? Because we have a long-term relationship with that person. We know them from all these different angles. We've gone through things hard together. We've committed to each other for the long haul. And I think when we think of those kind of relationships with grieving people, with hurting people, then we're not as apt to try to fix things quickly or to misappropriate Bible verses or spiritual truths that are truly meant to help. They certainly are. And I never want to diminish the deep value of our faith informing how we face and integrate our grief. But we're not as vulnerable to misusing those in ways that are deeply hurtful.
Mm, wow. Well, and like you said, if someone's willing to commit to sort of the long-term process, the risk of using those deteriorates and diminishes
It
as well.
does.
And I had many years ago, gosh, it's been 25, is that right? 25 years ago. Yeah, I had a little brother who passed away. He lived for a day. And I was kind of going into my teen years. So I was about 13, always wanted a brother. And it turned out that he had this very rare disease. We kind of found out shortly before his due date. And it was one of the most challenging, difficult times of my young adulthood. And I'll never forget the people that were surrounding me at that time that were just present. I don't remember what they said. I don't remember who gave a meal and who didn't or anything like that, but I remember their presence and their connection. And there's not something that you can say
Mhm.
truly. I mean, just with words alone, there's not a way to make it all better and to quote like fix it or something like that. And that's what a lot of us want to do when we see others in pain, when we care about someone and we see that they're hurting and they're mourning. You describe this with being a single mother now, a widower to your children, and seeing them and that hurt. It's the same thing for me as a dad with my kids. When they're in pain, I go into problem solving mode. I
Mhm.
have to fix it. I have to remove the pain. And we do that with people that we care the most about. And with grief, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't, the interventions that are needed aren't, like you said, just this quick fix. Let's just pop in, let's drop off the card. Okay, did my part, life goes on. It's a very patient understanding, a willingness to be present and to listen that makes the biggest difference. Clarissa, what you really do with this book and the work that you're doing is you bring hope. You bring
Thank you.
hope. And people need that now more than ever. I mean, across the globe for all sorts of reasons, really why
Mhm.
why we need that light in the world right now and why people need hope. for so many of us that lack it, that's the definition of despair, is when we begin to lose hope.
Mhm.
And you give a tool, a guide, a resource here to get through some of the most challenging times in life. I want to read this again. This is in the third part about the path leads on. You said, in infinite wisdom, God has brought you to this new day. In gracious love, you're here. There's still purpose for you. Good, beautiful, awe inspiring purpose. God invites you to live fully in the face of death. Again, just poetic description there about having purpose in life, about having hope again, being able to continue on. Can you tell the viewers just a little bit about what that rediscovery has been like in a personal way for you in that journey? Again, I don't want to give away everything that's in the book, but this is such a major part of what's happening for you now, 3 years out, being able to share your story, publish this book, is this newfound sense of purpose that was really a product of the hope that you found.
Yeah, I think that for Christians, the Apostle Paul tells us that we do not grieve as those who have no hope. And so we know, even in the very darkest moments of our loss, of our grief, that there's this, pardon me, an element of hope that is somewhere. It may be obscured, but it's still there. And so part of our purpose is to walk with grief in faithfulness, to turn with compassion, to hear its wisdom, to listen when it speaks, and to also hold tightly to the hand of God. And knowing that he promises us hope, not just the eternal hope of resurrection and new heavens and new earth, but he promises us resurrection today. And so a lot of that is our duty, our purpose, our meaning finding a task as we encounter our grief. And I think it's different for each person. When early grief is over for you, it's so unique. I know that in my own life, it took a really long time for me to be able to think about the future with hope. I was able to ground myself in the hope for today. My kids are healthy. I've got a job. I've put food on the table. I'm getting it done. And there was enough hope to kind of sustain me. But the hope that meant lifting my eyes and thinking about a year from now, maybe even 6 months from now, let alone 5 or 10 years from now, that was a hope that I still confess I'm working on. I'm working on recapturing that sense of God's goodness for the long haul. And I think it's okay to be in that place. It's okay when your life has been disrupted by loss to go back to the very basics of, this is what hope looks like for me today. Hope looks like me getting out of bed and taking a shower today, because yesterday despair looked like staying in bed and keeping the blinds closed. Today hope looks like calling a friend and making that connection with someone outside of myself. Whereas yesterday, despair meant I ignored all of my texts and I set my phone on silent. I couldn't deal with any of it. And so those little resurrection moments, I think in our daily rhythms, that's where we begin. And when we build upon that, we begin to be able to lift our eyes a little bit further. Okay, maybe to next week, to next month. And now I can plan a little bit further in advance, and I can look forward to a vacation in a year and say, Lord, in your goodness, would you make that happen for me and my family? But it takes a while. And I think that when we release ourselves from the desire to get it done, to work through five, imaginary stages, or, to get this process over with, when we realize grief as a companion, I think we could take a deep sigh of relief that the kind of urgent and frantic planning that may have been part of our days before, we can relinquish that and just step into a hopefulness that is a posture of trust. It is risky, it is mysterious, but it's also where Jesus promises to meet us and to offer us his kindness, knowing that, as scripture says, we're dust. He knows we're weak, he knows we're fragile. And so he offers us his lighter yoke, and he becomes the shepherd to us who willingly and lovingly carries the lambs in his arms.
Amazing. Yeah, he's the great comforter,
That's right.
for us through that. And one of my you reminded me one of my favorite scriptures about being transformed by renewing your mind. It's something that I interpret as a daily practice. And that's really your description also is it's a daily effort. It's an exercise. It's the ability to take action and a willingness to continue moving in whatever way might be most appropriate, especially when all of your feelings or desires are to retreat and to
That's
take a
right.
step back. When we're hurting, when we're in pain, and I know, again, so many people all over, whether it's related to direct loss of a loved one or all of the other things that have happened over the last 2.5, 3 years now, we have a temptation to retreat into fear and to not move forward in faith. And it's that daily practice of waking up, and maybe it looks like today I'm getting out of bed. I'm going to shower. I'm going to tend to, some of my responsibilities. I'm going to make the effort and make the call in whatever way might be most appropriate. Again, I think it's important for people to give themselves a little bit of grace in that, and to know again that as a believer that Christ is there along that journey. One of the descriptions you gave in the book is discovering Jesus as fully human. What you say is makes it so real, that relationship, because I think sometimes we forget that. We forget his sorrow. We forget the pain that he experienced, the hurt, the abandonment, the not just the physical pain that we're reminded of oftentimes, but the emotional sorrow that he experienced. And you describe it as being able to take that to him, present it, and he can unwrap it,
Mhm.
and he can carry it with us. And he said, one of the greatest gifts of my grief experience has been meeting Jesus as fully human, afraid in the Garden of Gethsemane, wounded by those who hated him, dying for those he loved. Over and over, I've discovered Jesus in Scripture as a vulnerable person just like me. And what a beautiful opportunity for everyone to recognize that companionship,
Mhm.
right? That Jesus has for them through this. I just want to extend that to all the listeners and viewers. If you haven't experienced a relationship like that, it's not complicated. it's it's not difficult to approach that with Jesus. He's there knocking on the door. Jumping in here toward the end, you described God's design also including resilience. You said a joyful, deeply satisfying life awaits you after loss. And I just absolutely love that. I think that you're the living example of that. And that's another thing that brings hope to so many people that might otherwise be tempted toward despair, is that you're living it. You're continuing to do this with your family, with your children, and the life that you're leading now, the work that you're doing, the impact that you have, the contribution, just everything. And so can you kind of share with those that might be in that space of potential despair, of thinking like, gosh, I don't have life beyond this loss. I
Mhm.
don't have something to look forward to. It can't get better. Because again, a joyful, deeply satisfying life awaits you after loss is something that people might really need to hear.
Yeah, I want to acknowledge it may sound like a fortune cookie kind of fortune, just so pie in the sky that it is not even attainable. And I think one of the reasons why gentle appears in the subtitle of the book is because I have always been an unwilling traveler on this journey. I am a fearful person. I have anxiety. I am not brave. I didn't even like thinking about death or medical things or someone in my family dying. This is never a path that I would have chosen. I'm when folks tell me you're so strong, I think, oh gosh, if you could see, if you could see all of the ways that I am so very weak. And yet I still believe that God's promises are true, that that he holds the widow's boundary stones in place, as he says in Proverbs, that he's the father to the fatherless and the protector and defender of the widow, that he has good things in store for us, a hope and a future. Those kind of promises, they don't die just because something tragic enters your life. Those promises still remain. And yes, it can be really difficult to figure out how to get from where I'm at in this mess and darkness of sorrow that I'm in and that promise that he has given to me. And so, in my own life, I choose to hold the mystery in the same hand. I choose to say, I don't know how this could be. In the same way that I think Job sat before God when God said, were you here when I created the universe? Were you here when I hung the stars? And Job finally is left to say, I have no idea how this could be. And that posture of radical trust, I think, is something that is a daily exercise, like you say, that it is a daily picking up of both the sorrow that we feel and these promises of God that we believe are bedrock to our existence, to our belovedness, and to the hope that we profess. And we keep rehearsing those to our hearts over and over again. One of my favorite verses is from Psalm 118. I shall not die, but live and declare the works of the Lord. And I can't tell you how many times over the last 3 years I have said those words with an angry, defiant tone in my voice, in a hopeless fear with tears in my eyes, pleading to God, I shall not die, but declare the works of the Lord. And so that deeply satisfying and joyful life that awaits you after loss, it's hard won. It is hard won, but it's a gift of God through the resurrection of Jesus. It's just a foretaste of all that remains to be seen for us. The things that First John tells us, no eye has seen or ear has heard. And so it's something that we hold before us. It's that pinhole light in that darkness, a point to walk toward, knowing that God has never failed his children and that as his beloved, his promises will always be true.
Wow, I love that. That's so good, and it's so true. Sometimes that's enough, right? That's what we need is that description you gave of a pinhole light. We just need enough light on the path for that next step and to keep moving forward, to know that he transforms all for good, and we don't always understand why or how, but we don't need to.
That's
That's
right.
that's not for us to know. And part of it is appreciating the mystery of it, knowing that there is purpose after pain. I know it sounds cliche, but I've experienced that on my own journey in really incredible, meaningful ways. I've done it with others as well, people that I've helped along in my journey, that oftentimes the purpose that we're called to later in life, to have more of a fulfilling, deep, meaningful life, the purpose that we can fulfill is somehow a new iteration or translation of the pain that we experienced earlier. And I think that there's a lot of meaning in when that is shared, right? Because we talked earlier about the risk of becoming more isolated and disconnected in a journey like this. And I think what you're doing in practicing your purpose now and in sharing your journey is the very opposite of that. It's actually reaching out and it's expanding and it's sharing that painful past, but it's become tremendous purpose and the impact that it can have for others to help them, just give them enough light, right, to get through. I think that's what God truly desires from us, and how scripture talks about not putting a bowl over the lamp,
Mhm.
right? That's what we probably want to do when we're in the middle of it and we're hurting. It's like, gosh, I know the light's still there, but all I want to do is just put a bowl, curl back up under the covers and be left alone. And, you know, God has the opportunity to move into other people's lives through this work, through serving this purpose, through this contribution, through a willingness to be open and not have all the answers, and knowing that it's okay, that like you said earlier, kind of fumbling along sometimes, that's where many of us find ourselves when we're willing to keep moving forward and we don't know what to do or the right next step to take. We feel like we're just like, oh my gosh, my failing so much more than, than I'm actually doing anything. And even that is part of the process. It's part of the journey. It's part of growth, and it's part of discovery of what a full and meaningful life really is. It's not having it all together, not having everything just in its right place. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it continues to hurt. You still continue to experience sorrow, and that's part of it as well. What a beautiful, beautiful opportunity this is. I'm so grateful for you, Clarissa. I really am. Where can people find you?
Well, my happy place on social media is Instagram. So you can join me at Mall Clarissa, and I love to connect with followers and respond to your questions and messages. And you can also find me at my website, clarissamall.com. And there you'll find more about my story and about my writing and speaking. It's a great sort of one stop shop to learn more about me.
Perfect. I want to encourage everyone again, pick up the book, order it. It's available everywhere. I know that this book is just going to have tremendous impact for so many people and the journeys that they're on. So grateful for you. Thanks for being here. Everyone that's been watching or listening, I just want to wish you all well. Whatever you're going through in life, know that there's always a reason to continue hoping, continue moving forward, and always remember to serve with humility, lead with confidence, and live with purpose, everybody. We'll see you soon. Thanks again. God bless.